He slammed the folder shut so hard half the room flinched. "We're sunsetting legacy functions," Trent barked, pacing like he thought the floor was his stage. "If you've been here longer than a decade, you're either a liability or a soon-to-be mentor." He glanced in my direction like I was a cracked Windows 7 laptop he couldn't wait to chuck into recycling. I didn't say a word, just shifted my pen between my fingers and waited for him to finish strutting. It was my job to clean up the mess after show ponies like him finished parading. Let me rewind before we hit the fireworks. I'm Dana Lang. Yes, of those Langs, the family name quietly buried in the original Virelon Dynamics charter, just below the operating agreements and the clause no one's bothered to read since 2010. For 15 years, I was the spinal cord of this company. Vendor compliance, federal logistics frameworks, IP protocol on defense-adjacent assets. If it ran through me. Not that anyone remembered. That was the beauty of being invisible until it wasn't. They all thought I was the office historian. Institutional memory. HR called me during one performance review as if I were a dusty filing cabinet in kitten heels. That was fine by me. Being underestimated was my favorite camouflage, and I'd worn it well, until Trent. Now would be a good time to ask you to like the video and subscribe. I know, nobody wants to hear it, but 97% of you are listening without ever clicking that button. It really helps the team keep stories like this alive. Thanks for supporting what we do. Back to Trent. He was the kind of kid who wore a vest to meetings and called it executive energy. Fresh out of some overpriced MBA petting zoo, hand-delivered into the CEO seat by his uncle's guilt and a $13 haircut. The kind of man who thought saying disruptive made him a visionary and saying synergy made him smart. Trent was dangerous, not because he was sharp, but because he was convinced he was. And Virelon was too tired to fight him. The old guard was slipping out the back door with their cardboard boxes and fat 401ks. I stayed. Not out of loyalty, but because I knew what was coming. Thalos Ventures had been circling us for 2 years, waiting for the perfect moment to scoop up our federal contracts and bleeding-edge distribution tech. They'd courted us quietly, checking compliance logs and IP firewalls like surgeons studying blueprints before open-heart surgery. We were finally ready. Every contract I'd shepherded, every clause I'd written, every workaround I'd solved with duct tape and prayer, it was all leading to this deal. It could have been clean. It should have been simple. But then Trent showed up and decided he was Moses parting the spreadsheets. At first, he treated me like a relic. "You're great for historical context," he said once during a strategy call, sipping kombucha and flexing his vocabulary like a toddler showing off a magic trick. He introduced new analysts who didn't know the difference between procurement and parole and told me to mentor them with grace. I nodded, smiled, took notes, then quietly added them to my incident report folder. The first crack in the veneer came during a vendor dispute. One of our biggest partners flagged a security protocol issue in a system I hadn't touched in months. Turns out Trent's new CTO bypassed my access and rewired an encryption pathway without understanding the handshake dependencies. When it failed, Trent blamed the legacy logs. I handed him a printed copy of the override notice. He blinked at it like I'd just handed him a dead cat. I didn't explain. I never do. I started showing up to meetings with a blank notepad and a closed mouth. That scared him more than any argument ever could. He wanted resistance, something to fight. But I gave him silence, and that made him reckless. Behind the scenes, I pulled every file related to our federal IP clauses. I reviewed the original founder agreements, the ones signed before Virelon ever secured its first defense contract. Clause 82B was still intact, tucked inside the transitional governance appendix. I smiled when I saw it, a smile like a match lighting in the dark. That clause didn't just make me a stakeholder, it made me a gatekeeper, a living clause in a dying system. And Trent had no idea that while he was prancing around in performance reviews and trying to reinvent the coffee machine policy, the foundation was still written in my hand. But I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Let him keep dancing. Let him wave his arms and toss titles around like party favors. He thought he was in charge. I was just waiting for him to prove it. By the time the third email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Shifting into the future," I could smell the pink slip through the screen. Trent had a way of weaponizing buzzwords like a trust fund kid playing Risk. No real skin in the game, just a smug grin and a vague idea of where the borders were. He'd been empowered with operational oversight, which meant he now had the power to rearrange furniture, rebrand job titles, and fire people he couldn't understand. Starting with legacy roles, as he called them, which, shocker, included me. He sent out a company-wide survey titled, "What Does Leadership Look Like to You?" with options like visionary, disruptive, and data forward. There wasn't even a blank space for competent. That told me everything I needed to know. At the Monday strategy sync, one I used to run before he stripped it down into a PowerPoint parade, he cut me off mid-sentence while I was walking through our Q3 vendor risk assessment. "Thanks, Dana," he said, not even looking up. "We appreciate your historical insights, but we're focused on forward momentum now. If you could help the younger team prep our integration packets instead, that'd be super valuable." Super valuable, like a butter churn at a Tesla factory. I just smiled and nodded, like a good ghost of operations past. The others glanced at me with that polite corporate guilt, the kind that says, "Sorry, but I have kids and a mortgage." No one would speak up. They didn't want to be next. That afternoon, HR called me in for what they called a light restructuring conversation. I wore navy and brought a pen. I always bring a pen when someone's about to insult me politely. "We just want to make sure your institutional knowledge is captured," the HR rep said, folding her hands like a prayer. "Would you be willing to mentor the integration leads over the next few weeks?" "Happy to support," I said, and wrote down every word she didn't say. Sunsetting, redundancy, offboarding. It wasn't about mentoring. It was about bottling me up before the acquisition so the new team wouldn't implode after I was gone. They were terrified of what I knew, but more terrified of acknowledging they needed me. So I played along. I went back to my desk, opened a folder labeled Legacy Systems, and began collecting. Not just passwords and access logs. I pulled every single contract I'd ever touched. Every vendor agreement, every federal compliance clause, every obscure tax protocol we'd used to stabilize our logistics rollout after the 2012 crash. Trent didn't understand that I was the documentation. I was the system, and I had receipts. I dug into the oldest files, the ones scanned back when our office copiers still squealed like a tortured hamster. That's when I found the original Equity Framework doc. Clause 82B, same as I'd remembered it. Back when the original founders were pulling together a federal bid, there was a clause that named me as executive custodian of federal transfer rights. Fancy title for a glorified keyholder, but it meant one thing. No ownership handoff on any defense-aligned asset could proceed without my written approval. It was put in place as a risk buffer, in case a hostile buyout tried to swallow the IP. It wasn't meant to last forever, but no one had ever removed it. It was still active, still logged, still binding. The company had changed CRMs twice, restructured the executive suite 3 times, and swapped out CEOs like air filters. But that clause sat untouched like a loaded pistol in the glove box of a car no one drives anymore. Until now. And the funny thing? Trent was too lazy to even notice it. He just assumed legal had done its job. He trusted automation more than experience, trusted fresh MBAs more than lived expertise, trusted himself most of all. I scheduled a private lunch with our old compliance advisor. She'd retired 2 years ago, but still did consulting on the side. Over Cobb salads and ginger tea, I asked her one question. "Is Clause 82B still enforceable?" She blinked, then smiled slowly. "Only if no one's nullified it." She paused, thoughtful. "Did they?" "No," I said. "They didn't even know it existed." She tapped her fork on the edge of the plate. "Then, honey, you don't need to fight him. You just need to wait for him to screw it up in front of the wrong people." And that's exactly what I planned to do. Quietly, precisely, patiently, because Trent didn't want a mentor. He wanted a mirror that wouldn't talk back. And I was more than willing to let him talk himself into the fall. The office door was already cracked open when I arrived. Symbolic, I suppose. HR always wanted these chats to feel collaborative, like we were brainstorming ways for me to vanish gracefully. Madison from People Ops was sitting there, straight-backed and too smiley, with a folder in Virellon blue. I recognized the color instantly. It was the same kind they used when someone's email mysteriously stopped working mid-sandwich. "Dana," she chirped. Thanks for meeting with me. We just wanted to loop you in on how your role might evolve as we approach the final phase of acquisition. Evolve, I echoed, hanging my coat slowly. That's a beautiful word for extinction. Her smile wobbled. Oh no, nothing's finalized. You've been such a foundational part of the company. Truly. We're just sunsetting certain legacy roles to align with Thalos's operational framework. Integration is about efficiency, you understand. Of course, I said calmly. I'd worked with DoD auditors who had warmer bedside manners. She flipped open the folder and launched into something that sounded like a TED Talk titled How to Exit Quietly Without Making Eye Contact. My name had already been moved to a dotted line reporting structure under someone named Connor H., who I assumed was the toddler in a Patagonia vest I'd seen last week asking what a supply chain was. Connor will be our integration lead, Madison was saying. He's asked if you can help organize and sanitize the vendor and compliance archives, just to make sure the Thalos team has a clean view. You've always had such meticulous records. You want me to prep my own erasure, I said, not angry. Just noting it out loud like you'd point out mold in a vent. Not erasure, she said quickly. Evolution. Right. I let the silence hang just long enough for her to get uncomfortable, then asked, before I begin migrating any files, could you check something for me in compliance records? Of course, she said, relieved to be back on script. I'd like to verify whether my deferred equity agreement from 2010 is still logged, specifically the federal alignment clause regarding transfer authority. She blinked. I'm not sure that's necessary for the current transition plan. Still, I said, I'd appreciate the confirmation. She nodded tightly and scribbled something into a notepad she'd absolutely never open again. I'll flag legal. Which, in HR speak, meant, we're going to ignore this until you're no longer our problem. That was fine. I didn't need their confirmation. I already had it. As soon as I got back to my desk, a desk now awkwardly wedged between Connor's collaboration hub and a pile of unopened ergonomic chair boxes, I started auditing. Not the files they told me to clean, but the ones they didn't want anyone touching. I pulled out the original IP structuring docs, cross-checked the metadata stamps, validated the FedRAMP handoff logs, and flagged every single clause that included the words approval authority, binding designation, and federal transfer stipulation. What I found wasn't just messy, it was weaponized negligence. Virelon had skipped 3 rounds of policy realignment during executive transitions. The legal team had auto-migrated most of our foundational contracts into cloud templates without preserving the embedded signatures. But I had the originals, printed, signed, time-stamped. Clause 82B was still live. Even better, it was explicitly referenced in the acquisition prep folder as under review, which meant someone saw it and chose to ignore it. I added that to my list, quietly. Then I turned my attention to the data Connor's team was preparing for Thalos. Sloppy summaries, mismatched timestamps, internal metrics listed in 2 different formats. One compliance log even referenced a non-existent audit from 2022, which I knew had been canceled because I was the one who called it off when the lead investigator got COVID and the backup was stuck in Des Moines. I cleaned nothing. I corrected nothing. I watched them flail with confidence and logged every misstep like a coronial report. Because Trent wanted to streamline the company like it was a YouTube channel. Connor wanted to impress Thalos like it was a college internship. And HR wanted me to go quietly. But I wasn't going. I was just getting into position. The folder was so old it had a coffee ring the size of a quarter and someone's chicken scratch that read, Lang, do not shred. I found it wedged behind a busted surge protector in the back of my filing cabinet, a cabinet HR had tried to have digitally streamlined 3 times before giving up. Good thing, too, because inside that folder, nestled between a disintegrating NDA and an early version of our federal IP trust framework, was the page. Clause 82B. I didn't even have to read it to know what it was. I remembered drafting it with a pencil and 2 aspirin during a rain delay at DC Logistics Week back in 2010. We were just starting to scale, desperate to look bigger than we were for federal contracts. Our legal team at the time had cooked up a structuring model that would shield our intellectual property in the event of outside takeover, and they named me, Dana Lang, as the executive custodian of federal transfer rights, mostly because I was the only one who knew how any of our systems actually worked. It wasn't about ego back then. It was about risk mitigation. Someone had to be the keystone, and I didn't argue when they gave me the pen. The clause was simple. Any acquisition involving more than 20% transfer of federal-aligned assets required my sign-off. Not just notification, approval. And unless that clause had been nullified and restructured under a new custodian, it was still active. Most companies clean this kind of thing up when they transition leadership. Virelon didn't. Probably because Trent's uncle assumed I'd never need it, or worse, forgot I existed the second he handed his idiot nephew the keys to the kingdom. That was his mistake. I took the clause, made 2 copies, one physical, one scanned with metadata capture, and slid the original back into the folder, just in case I ever needed a little theater later on. Then I called Claudia Mason. Claudia's the kind of lawyer who doesn't advertise. No website, no Instagram with cutesy, girl boss-esque captions. Just a voicemail that says, "Leave it, I'll find it," and a callback that makes you feel like you're talking to a scalpel. She answered on the second ring. Lang. Claudia, I've got a clause I need your eyes on. Founding Doc, 2010, Clause 82B. You still breathing? She asked. Then it's probably still valid. Send it. I emailed her the scan. She called me back before I could finish my coffee. Oh, sweet hell, she said. They didn't remove this? Nope. Did they restructure your designation? Nope. Did they file a nullification under amended IP realignment? I smiled. Claudia, they don't even know what any of those words mean. She laughed. Then Trent's about to choke on his own merger. I leaned back in my chair. So it's enforceable? Let me put it this way. If Thalos signs that acquisition packet without your name on the signature line, they're in breach of a federally conditioned IP trust, which means the contracts attached to that IP, distribution, encryption protocols, customs clearances, go void. I whistled low. You think Thalos knows? If they're smart? Yes. If they're desperate? Not yet. I nodded. Then we wait. Wait for what? For Trent to get loud in the wrong room. I'll bring the papers. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that every email, every eye roll, every "thanks, Dana, but we've got it from here" was building toward one moment, a moment he'd never see coming. Because Clause 82B wasn't a shield, it was a trigger, and I was the one with the finger on it. The invite didn't come. Not to my inbox, not to my calendar, not even as one of those passive-aggressive, just looping you in. CC's Trent liked to use like digital air horns, but I knew exactly when the final buyer presentation was scheduled, down to the room number and brand of bottled water they'd set out. Connor, our darling integration lead, had accidentally forwarded the catering confirmation to the old operations distro list I still had access to. Rookie mistake. He probably thought legacy accounts were just ghosts. I showed up 10 minutes early, not to be dramatic, just to choose my seat. I wore black. Tailored, no frills, hair back, not a power move, not exactly. But not the cardigan and clipboard they were expecting either. I didn't carry anything but a small folder and a single business card. The room was full of tension dressed as polish. Thalos acquisition team looked crisp, cold, and impatient, like they'd rather be anywhere else but knew this deal was worth missing dinner for. Their CEO, Randall Stone, was already seated. Tall, gray at the temples, eyes like polished steel. I recognized him from the DC Defense Conference 3 years back. He hadn't recognized me then. I made sure he would now. I took a chair along the side wall. No name tag, no greeting. Just a quiet presence marked as Legacy Observer on the printed agenda. Trent strolled in 5 minutes late, all swagger and expensive watch energy. He shot me a glance like I was gum on the sole of his shoe, then ignored me completely. He was wearing that smug, glossy grin he saved for moments he thought were cinematic. In his mind, this was his curtain call. Welcome, everyone, he began, clasping his hands like a TED Talk pastor. Today marks the culmination of our strategic realignment and future-facing vision. Virelon is ready to enter its next chapter, with agility, with purpose, and with a modern leadership approach. I counted the buzzwords like notches on a bar stool. He clicked through slides, introduced Connor as Chief Transition Architect, flashed an org chart with a dozen new titles and none of the names that actually built the company, and wrapped it all with a little bow of self-congratulation. Before we move forward with documentation, Trent said, glancing theatrically at Randall Stone, there's one more small realignment. Dana Lang, our legacy operations lead, has been an important part of Virulon's journey. But as we shift toward optimized verticals, she'll be transitioning out. Dana, he added with a fake warm smile, take 2 weeks, tie up what you need. We appreciate you. I didn't even blink. I just reached slowly into my folder and slid one card across the table, flat, quiet, deliberate, right into the path of Randall Stone. He picked it up, turned it over, and read the title. Then he looked at me, then back at the card, then at Trent. And the man, who hadn't cracked a smile the entire hour, broke into a low, surprised laugh that turned every head at the table. Trent blinked. Everything okay? Randall leaned back, still holding the card like it was a golden ticket someone had dropped in the trash. Ms. Lang, he said. Interesting title. Trent squinted, trying to read it upside down. Oh, that's just a legacy designation. Doesn't mean anything in current operations. Randall didn't look at him. He was still watching me. Executive Custodian of Federal Transfer Rights. He read aloud, savoring the syllables. That's not just a title. That's a clause trigger. Silence. I didn't move, didn't speak, just waited, hands folded, heart steady. Randall turned slowly toward his own legal counsel seated beside him, who had already opened his laptop and was typing furiously. One of the Thalos analysts whispered something. Another tapped on a file. The mood shifted so fast you could feel it in the carpet. Mr. Reed, Randall said to Trent, his voice ice smooth. We were assured this acquisition had full sign-off. Were you aware that a federal IP clause still required Ms. Lang's explicit approval? Trent's face paled. Our legal team, I thought that clause was obsolete. You thought wrong, Randall said flatly. Connor cleared his throat and immediately regretted it. I stood up slowly, collected my folder, and tucked the chair back in with the same care I'd used for 15 years holding this place together. I looked at Trent just once. He opened his mouth. I left the room before he could find words. Behind me, the room erupted like someone had pulled a fire alarm no one could find. Voices tangled over each other. Trent barking something about chain of command. Connor stumbling through buzzwords like delegated authority and modern frameworks. And Virulon's junior counsel flipping through a packet like the missing page might magically reappear if she turned it fast enough. But Randall Stone wasn't looking at any of them. He was still holding my card between his fingers like it was the key to a vault, and I was the only one who knew the combination. I'll repeat myself, he said, voice cutting clean through the noise. We are not signing this agreement without Ms. Lang's explicit approval. But she's not even on the current board, Trent stammered, red blooming across his neck. She's a consultant, at best. This is a legacy technicality, some dusty clause from a decade ago that doesn't reflect current leadership. Randall gave him a long, flat stare that should have been mounted in a museum under Corporate Fatality Untitled. And yet, Randall said slowly, the clause is still in force. Clause 82B, custodian sign-off required for federal IP transitions exceeding 20% of core infrastructure, especially where defense contracts are involved, which, as I understand from your own documentation, is precisely what this acquisition entails. Trent looked to his legal team like they might save him. They didn't. One of them was visibly sweating, the other pretending to type. I remained standing, silent, steady. You don't understand, Trent tried again. I'm the acting executive. I was appointed by... We're not discussing title, Randall cut in. We're discussing authority. And the authority here, he tapped my business card once against the table, is hers. The energy shifted like tectonic plates. One moment, Trent was the golden boy running the show. The next, he was a sophomore who'd brought the wrong slides to a dissertation defense. Randall turned to me. Ms. Lang, would you be willing to step into an advisory position to oversee proper compliance alignment during integration? My voice was calm, but I made sure the entire room heard it. I'd be willing. He nodded once. Then he stood. This meeting is adjourned pending proper authorization. My team will reschedule once Ms. Lang's signature is available. Trent looked like he'd been gut-punched by a stapler. Wait, he sputtered. Are you telling me she has the power to block this? Randall paused on his way to the door. I'm telling you she already has. He gestured to his team, who began gathering their materials with silent precision. Nobody from Virelon moved. They were still frozen in the awkward tension of realizing the crown they'd handed Trent was made of Play-Doh. I walked out with Randall's team. Not fast, not smug, just steady, like a metronome ticking away the last seconds of Trent's illusion. Connor tried to make eye contact on my way out, but I didn't give it to him. He hadn't earned it. Once we reached the hallway, Randall extended his hand. You buried the lead, Ms. Lang. I shook it. I always preferred people find it on their own. He smiled. Let us know when you're ready to sign. Oh, I'm ready, I said. I just wanted them to hear the silence first. Because that's what power sounds like when it walks out of the room and takes the deal with it. Monday morning hit different. The parking lot was half full when I pulled in. No valet, no flashy announcements, just a quiet chill in the air and the weight of knowing a storm had passed, and I was the one who'd steered it straight through their umbrella. I walked in through the back corridor, the one where I used to duck meetings and slip files under people's doors when they forgot what deadlines looked like. Now I wasn't avoiding anyone, because the building wasn't humming. It was holding its breath. No greetings, no forced smiles, just silence and the occasional sound of someone typing faster than they needed to. Trent's corner office door was closed. That alone told me something had shifted. He never closed it unless he was gloating or Googling terms he didn't understand. The boardroom lights were on. I stepped in and saw it immediately. My name. Dana Lang, Interim Operations Lead, Integration Transition. It was right there on the first slide of the updated acquisition deck, projected in full color, approved by Thalos Legal and Virelon's own board. Same board that hadn't said a damn thing in my defense 3 weeks ago when Trent started swinging his axe through org charts like he was pruning a tree he didn't know the name of. They'd known better than to fight it now. Randall made it clear. Compliance wasn't optional, and neither was I. The entire document had been restructured over the weekend. My inbox had received a secure link at 3:12 a.m. Sunday, along with a single message. Per your authority, please review before we proceed. I'd reviewed it with coffee and quiet satisfaction. The revised deal excluded Trent from any future leadership capacity. His name appeared exactly once in an appendix outlining transition courtesy titles, specifically advisor, non-voting, non-operational, temp to exit. They let him keep the badge. They didn't let him back in the room. I was on my second cup of coffee when he finally found me. I was sitting at my old desk, now reclaimed, sorting through compliance notes left half-finished by Connor's little transition circus. He didn't knock, just marched in like he still owned the place, face tight, jaw twitching like it couldn't decide between rage and panic. You planned this. I looked up slowly, let the silence hang until it turned uncomfortable, then tilted my head. You signed the terms. Trent's eyes darted like he was trying to spot a trap door he could still crawl through. You went around me, undermined my leadership, you humiliated me in front of investors. I folded the folder I was holding and placed it neatly on the desk. I enforced an existing clause, one you ignored. You weren't humiliated by me, Trent. You were humiliated by your own shortcuts. He stepped closer, but stopped short when he realized I wasn't moving. You think you're untouchable now? He sneered. That you've won? I stared at him flatly. I think you still don't understand the difference between having a title and holding the pen. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I stood, slowly, not to threaten, but to shift the room. You tried to erase me from the very structure I built. Now I'm the only reason the lights are still on. You don't have to like it, but you will respect the ink. He didn't respond, just looked at the walls like they'd changed language. Eventually, he left. No parting words, no final blow, because he knew it wouldn't land. Later that afternoon, the new integration schedule went live. I signed off on every single transition, every vendor, every channel, every rehire. The company was moving again, cleaner, tighter, calmer. And Trent? He was still in the building, but the building no longer had space for him. The new badge was printed in grayscale, no color, no executive access, and a photo that made Trent look like he'd just been told lunch was canceled indefinitely. It read, Trent Reed, Advisor, Transition Team, Non-Voting. They didn't even bother giving him a mailbox, just a desk near the loading dock wedged between surplus monitors and a dying ficus that looked like it had been through the same HR cycle he had. I passed him twice that week. Once in the elevator, where he tried to nod at me like nothing had happened. I didn't return it. The second time, he was trying to figure out how to submit a calendar invite from his downgraded Access account. The system blocked him. I saw the red error flash across his screen. He didn't realize I'd built that system years ago. HR processed his 2-week notice just like he'd requested mine. Template email, polite tone, full severance, and a gentle suggestion that he use the time for professional recalibration. I saw the draft before it went out. Madison had written it herself, copied almost word for word from the one Trent had tried to use on me. Irony has a way of looping back with surgical precision. He didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight. By Friday, his calendar was empty. No meetings, no invites, no one asked his opinion because no one needed it. He started wearing headphones around the office like he was trying to tune it all out. I didn't bother checking what was playing. Probably podcasts about visionary leadership hosted by people who also just got fired by their uncles. Meanwhile, I got to work. The real kind. I pulled open the backlog of compliance requests that had sat untouched during Trent's streamlining era. Vendor clearance expirations, outdated encryption protocols, and a 3-month-old flagged alert from a customs liaison about mislabeled export data, all ignored under the shiny new dashboards Connor had built. I fixed them all within a week, quietly, efficiently. Next came the staff realignment. Not layoffs, rebuilds, the kind that happen when you listen to who actually keeps the company upright instead of who yells the loudest during performance reviews. I restored 2 senior managers who had been sidelined under the flattened org model, gave them team leads, budgets, and the freedom to do what they'd been doing under the radar anyway. One of them, Marcy, cried in my office, said it was the first time in 2 years anyone had looked at her metrics and understood what she'd built. I told her I didn't care about tiers, just continuity. I reintroduced weekly cross-department reviews, not the performative slide decks Trent loved, but the actual sit-downs where people talk about real problems without worrying if their buzzword quota was met. Within days, you could feel it. The noise dropped. Emails made sense again. Vendors stopped calling in a panic. Procurement logs actually matched inventory. The place started breathing like it used to, before everything became a branding exercise. On Thursday, Randall sent over a note. Operations look tight. Keep going. I didn't reply, just nodded once at the screen. Trent's last act as advisor was to email me a Google Doc suggesting a new onboarding slide about culture first strategy. I forwarded it to HR and archived it. He left the following Monday. No party, no statement, no crowd of well-wishers, just a quiet badge drop and a weak smile for the receptionist, who barely looked up. By Tuesday, no one mentioned him. By Friday, we'd already removed his Slack account and reassigned his MacBook. By the following week, the only trace of Trent Reed at Verilon was a coffee mug with boss mode peeling off the ceramic and a sticky note inside that read, "Remember to crush Q3." I used the mug to water the ficus. It perked up by Thursday. That's the thing about transitions. Sometimes the best ones start with subtraction. The restaurant was quiet elegance, one of those converted bank vault places with dim lighting, waiters in suits, and a wine list that read like a federal indictment. Every seat at the table had been pre-assigned, and mine, near the center, directly across from Randall Stone, wasn't a courtesy seat. It was strategic. The Thalos acquisition dinner wasn't just celebration, it was calibration. A handshake in linen, a performance in velvet. The room was full of smiles, but none of them casual. Everyone there had earned their presence, or bought it, except one person who wasn't there. Trent. Not even a ghost of him. No regrets email, no quiet exit toast. He'd been erased so thoroughly from the integration plan that his name didn't even make the footer of the closing deck. The only thing that marked his time at Verilon now was a broken monitor in the AV closet and a forgotten Canva login no one bothered to reset. I didn't mention him. No one did. Randall raised his glass halfway through the second course, roasted duck, perfectly plated, and cleared his throat with that kind of practiced authority that says, "This won't be long, but you will remember it." "I just want to take a moment," he began, "to acknowledge what real leadership looks like. It's not in org charts. It's not in title inflation or buzzwords or posturing. It's in continuity, in clarity, and in competence." His eyes landed on me. "To Virilon's backbone, and now our bridge forward, Dana Lang." The room gave polite applause, not thunderous, not performative, real, the kind that means you earned this, and we know it. He reached under the table and handed me a small box, mahogany engraved with the Thalos seal. Inside was a brushed steel token the size of a coin, inscribed around the edge, "Continuity is currency." The center held the date of signing and one word etched deeper than the rest, "Custodian." Someone, one of the analysts, I think, leaned toward me with a glass of Pinot and a curious grin. "Hey," he whispered, "what was the title on your card that made Randall laugh like that? At the meeting?" I smiled and set the box down gently beside my plate. "Executive Custodian of Federal Transfer Rights," I said. He blinked. "That's real?" "Very," I said. "And binding." He laughed once, a quiet snort of disbelief, then shook his head. "Unreal. They really didn't know who you were, did they?" "They knew what they wanted me to be," I replied. "And that's not the same." The rest of the evening passed in soft conversation, strategic networking, and quiet satisfaction. I stayed until dessert, signed 2 NDAs for side integration planning, and left with my shoulders lighter than they'd been in years. Outside, the valet handed me the keys and smiled. "Big event tonight?" I looked back at the windows glowing with polished celebration, then slid into the driver's seat. "Just dinner," I said. And as I pulled away from the curb, I thought about Trent, how he'd built his entire identity around being in charge, but never once checked who actually held the levers. Turns out, being in charge doesn't matter, unless your name is on the clause that stops the money.